Hans Niemann has just won the Tournament of Peace in Croatia with a very impressive 8 out of 9, crushing all the Grandmasters in a very impressive way. And in this video I'm going to show you what happened in that last round game. He played with the white pieces against a very strong Grandmaster from Ukraine, Anton Korobov. And this game, wow guys, this is just simply amazing. Let's have a look. Subscribe to my channel and then I will show you what happened. e4, c5, knight f3, d6, and Hans likes to play this move, bishop b5 check. It's called the Moscow system. Knight d7, castling kingside, and here black played the move a6. There are two big options here for white. It's either to trade off the bishop for the knight, but Hans goes for the move bishop d3, and he's a big expert on this line. I will tell you what his experience is. After knight gf6, the rook goes to e1, and of course this bishop is badly placed on d3, but it's just temporarily placed here because after the move e6, the bishop goes back to f1, and the bishop is doing absolutely fine. It's helping the king, and it's not standing in the way of any other pieces. So here black needs to come up with a plan how to develop its pieces. Obviously this bishop likely can come to e7. What are you going to do with the bishop from c8? Well, there are ideas to play something like b5, but with the pawn on b5 you give white also options to play a4, so that can work against black, and therefore Korobov played here the move b6. It's a more modest continuation, but at least it doesn't give a hook. It will not give white the possibility to open up the queen side. So here white played the move c4, and after bishop to b7, the knight comes to c3, and well, very soon white is planning to play the move d4, and with this pawns on c4 and e4, you get a so-called typical hedgehog structure where white has a bit more space. It's always a little bit more pleasant for your pieces to be able to maneuver more flexibly. So therefore knight e5 was played, and that's a very interesting idea because black is offering the exchange of knights, and white should definitely not take here because these double pawns, they're actually quite good because white cannot really open the center. This bishop on f1 is looking bad. There will be pressure along this half open d file. So Hans goes here for the move d4 instead, and after knight takes f3, obviously you cannot take back with the queen because of c takes d4 and you lose a pawn. So the idea of white's concept is to voluntarily accept this move, doubled pawns, g takes f3, and well, it may look ugly, but in a way these double pawns, they are supporting white's center as well, and this position has not been seen in that many games, but Hans had played it twice before against Anish Giri and against Yilmaz. Both games were played in 2022. And well, Anish played here c takes d4, which is probably the best move. Bishop e7 was played by Yilmaz, but that also allows white to play d5 at the suitable moment when the bishop is kind of locked on b7. Well, let's see what Korobov played here. There followed the move g6. Bishop comes to e3, bishop g7, queen d2, castling kingside, rook a d1. I think white's moves, they are very clear, very understandable. They are nicely placed in the center, white's pieces, and you're putting pressure against the pawn on d6 indirectly. So normally when you have a fianchettoed bishop, you would rather have the pawn on e7. But now, okay, the pawn is on e6. It's a different story. Black played here the move bishop to c6, and white goes for bishop g5, putting more pressure against that knight on f6. If white does get a chance, then probably queen f4 will come. Ideas with e5 are in the air. So therefore black decides here to do something about it by playing the move queen b8. But I don't like that move. The queen is far away from the action. A better idea for these structures is to take on d4, queen takes d4, when it looks as if black has some serious problems, but after a move like h6, white can win the pawn by taking on f6 followed by taking on d6, but here you always have a bit of compensation because of the weakened dark squares. I think this bishop looks quite nice. The knight on c3 doesn't have that many great prospects, so therefore I think black should have initiated that pawn sack. But Queen b8 was played in the game. As I said, I feel the queen is too far away from where the action is going to take place. And now Hans played this move, d5. That's an excellent idea to attack the bishop. Pawn takes, c takes d5, and the bishop goes back to d7. So here, once again, white has a very nice pawn center. It more or less looks like a Benoni. If you have been following my channel, you remember Hans playing Benoni himself earlier in the tournament against Grandmaster Kozul. But now he's on the white side and he needs to show that he has a nice space advantage and he can eventually play for an attack. The big question is, of course, how is white going to do that? Is he trying to march forward with its pawns, maybe with f4 and e5 later? Or is he trying to make use of the open g file? Well, let's see. Knight e2 was played first, rook e8, and well, the knight is actually on its way to g3. It could have gone there right away, but Hans played first. Bishop to g2, and I think it's fine to play in this way, but probably you're not 100% sure if you need your bishop on g2 actually, but Hans doesn't want to commit himself that much. He keeps the knight on e2, and after the move b5, he goes for this move, king h1. Black is going to advance the pawns on the queen side. That's actually a very typical strategy. That's the side of the board where black is better. Black has an extra pawn there, so a typical plan is trying to bring up these pawns, create an passed pawn as black, or try to open up files to generate counterplay there, whereas white will continue with its attacking ideas on the other side of the board. So knight g3 was played, and here white is just about to play a move like queen f4. I think that's very unpleasant move to face, because the knight doesn't have a good square to go to, and of course it's important to have that knight on g3, because with the queen on f4, knight h5 is not really an option because of knight takes h5. Therefore, black needs to find another way to deal with the threat of queen f4. I think queen d8 is a better move than what was played in the game. It looks strange though that you place yourself in a pin, the knight cannot move, but after something like queen f4, you can put a rook on e5 so white doesn't get a chance to take the pawn on d6. I think it's not easy for white to make progress here. It's a very exciting middle game. A lot of things can still happen there. But Korobov played here the move h5. So the idea is that if now queen f4, the knight can come back to h7. The knight is safe. You're kicking this bishop away and black is having everything under control. But queen f4 is not the only idea white had in mind. And Hans played here this move, rook g1. He wants to keep the center intact. He's not going to mobilize that pawn chain, but he's looking for ways to make an attack happening against that black king. Now, if knight h7 is ever going to be played, the bishop can just drop back, so that's not an issue for white. And, well, black went here for the move rook a7. All these kind of moves, they feel a little bit slow, and it's always the typical clash where one side is playing on one wing, whereas the other side is playing on the other wing, playing against the opponent's king. I always take the side to play for a mating attack against your opponent's king. I mean, even if black will be able to defend, it's not easy for black at all. So the bishop comes back to f1. So now we understand what Hans had been doing with the bishop. First he needed to make space with its rook. Now the rook is here. The bishop will come now to e2. And that's a very interesting plan, because now the bishop has done its job. It's supporting the center. It is no longer standing in the way of the white rooks. And ideally, white is going to double on the g-file with these pieces. So the bishop goes back to c8. But now there's this idea. Bishop takes f6. Bishop takes f6. Knight takes h5. White is winning a pawn. But that's not the end of the story, because the bishop goes back to h8. The bishop stays on this diagonal. That's very important, because there will never be a mating threat on g7. Of course, the knight can never be taken because of the pin along the g-file. White played here queen h6, so this looks very threatening, but after queen b6, black is also looking for counterplay against the pawn on f2. So what should white do? Well, there are very tempting sacrifices with rook takes g6, but they are simply not going to work yet, because after, let's say, rook g1, queen d4 is a nice defensive idea. And Well, if you take on g6, the king comes to f8, it protects the rook, and well, there's maybe perpetual, but there's definitely not checkmate because the queen is helping in defense. That's very important. So we take it back. There is no need to sacrifice material yet. Before you do so, make sure to optimize your own position. And therefore the move played by Hans is very human. He played here rook g2. Just protecting the pawn on f2, keeping the rook on d1 so the queen cannot come to d4, and whenever the time is there, you can bring your rook to the g file. I think that makes a lot of sense. Rook e2, e7, here again. You don't play the move rook g1 because of queen d4, and there are no immediate mating threats yet because the queen and bishop are guarding a lot of squares. But instead, Hans played another very fine attacking move, because how are you going to eventually break through? Well, this move, f4, that's the key. Because you have double pawns, you can use at least one of them. So white is threatening here to play the move f5 to put pressure against the pawn on g6, opening up black's king's position. But of course the drawback is that the pawn on e4 can now be taken. However, the difference is that this rook is no longer helping in defense. And there is now this move, rook takes g6, very important idea. F takes g6, queen takes g6, the king goes to f8. Now you may of course take the rook on e4, but that slows down the initiative. For instance, if you do take here, it's queen takes f2 and it's anybody's game. Black is still hanging in there. Much better is to give a check with the queen on h6. That's very important, because what is black going to play now? Well, they're in the game. Korobov went for the move bishop g7. We will discuss that in a second. But how about a move like king g8? Well, king g8, there's rook g1, and this is leading to checkmate in a few moves. That's of course not what black wants. If the king goes to e8, it's queen takes h8 with check, and the attack goes on. It's also not good. But how about this move? If the king instead goes to e7, well, then you can also take on h8. You're an exchange down as white. Of course, black can take on e2 when white is actually a rook down, but there is no coordination. This king on e7 is really badly placed. There is rook g1 now as an important line. This was of course calculated by Niemann, threatening rook g7 with checkmate. If the king goes to d7, now rook g8, and you're just penetrating into black's position. And for instance, if you move the queen somewhere, it's queen g7, rook e7, and now knight f6. That's the key idea. Because of course the pawn on d5 takes away the escape squares from the king, king c7, queen takes e7, and it's going to be a game over. This is one of the many lines which are there, but of course some lines had to be calculated, others you can just rely on your intuition. After queen h6, bishop g7 played, now it's knight takes g7, and well, this knight cannot stay on the board. If you take on e2, which was not played, it's knight e6 with a double check of knight and queen, king f7, and it's just going to be checkmate in a few moves. That's a very typical mating pattern. There followed rook takes g7, but now the rook comes into g1, and this rook is just pinned and will be lost in a few moves. What should black do? Can you really try to defend the rook on g7? Well, in the game there followed this move, bishop g4, but let's briefly discuss queen d4 when the queen protects the rook. Well, it's queen h8, king f7, and now the bishop comes to h5. And well, if the king goes away, you take the rook on g7. If you play rook g6, it's bishop takes with check, king e7, queen e8, king f6, queen f7 is just checkmate. So now we understand why bishop g4 is played. If you do take with the rook, there is queen d4, and this bishop on e2 cannot come to h5. That makes a huge difference. So after bishop g4, rather than taking with the rook, you have to take with the bishop. So you give up the threat of taking the rook on g7, but black cannot do much about the threats. Now after queen d4, the bishop comes into e6 to take away the f7 square from the black king. If you eliminate this bishop, you can just give a check on h8. That's just crushing. You cannot do anything with black. If you block with the rook, the queen on d4 is hanging. While after king f7, it's d takes e6 with check. And after taking the pawn, it's queen takes g7 and white emerges with an extra rook. Therefore, instead, Korobov decided not to give up its rook for the bishop, but play the move queen takes b2. He's grabbing another pawn, but he couldn't do much else. Queen h8 check. King has to go to e7. Now it's rook to g7. King f6. And now it's queen h6 with checkmate. And that makes it 8 out of 9. 7 wins, 2 draws, and a 29, I think 46 performance, if I'm not mistaken. That's just absolutely insane. And that brings Hans to the live ratings on 2694, which is just almost 2700. We will Hans see back in the 2700 club very soon. And that could already be in a very few days, because straight after this tournament, after the last round, Hans needs to fly to London because the next tournament is waiting for him, the London Chess Classic. He's going to face a lot of strong players in that field. It's another round-robin tournament, so we are all curious to see how Hans is going to continue his amazing streak in this tournament from Zagreb. We will see Hans in the next couple of days for sure again. Make sure to subscribe, and I will see you soon back. Bye-bye.